Hello everyone, it's Meg, and in this video I'm going to show you a few of my personal tips for how to create a realistic organic with the help of some worldedit and voxel sniper. Now, the methods I show you is just my own personal way of doing them. It's by no means the only way or the only correct way to do it. I just wanted to give you an idea of the process I go through when creating my organics, and maybe you'll learn something from it. I think it's rather obvious, but you do need to have a plan of what you're going to build before you can start doing anything. So once you find a reference photo or have a good idea of what it is you'll be building, then we can get started. I'm going to do a human as an example, but I use these same methods no matter what organic I do. Now the first step that I always do is I'm going to create an armature for my organic. You could also call it a skeleton or a framework. And to create this, I'm just going to use a very small sphere brush. Smaller is always better than larger at this stage. And now using that brush, I'm going to draw out the position of the legs, torso, and arms for my organic. We don't need to worry about the head, hands, or feet at this point. This is just focusing on the proportions and the overall pose. I always find myself adjusting the pose later on once I start adding more shape to the organic. Just take your time and do the best you can to get it as close to what you want. In order to get the proportions right, you're going to need to look at it from a distance. So take the time to frequently step back and examine it that way. Another method I sometimes use to create my armature is with a laser brush. And this is a craft script command. I'll provide some links in the description for where you can get this. And what this does is it will allow me to draw a straight line from wherever I'm clicking to wherever I'm standing. This method can be a little bit trickier. It's not as precise as when you're drawing it out with a sphere brush, but it does make a cleaner line. Either method works just as well. You just might find one method to be easier than another. I do know that when working with extremely large organics, I always find the sphere brush to be more handy because it does give me more accuracy. But again, it all depends on the builder and what your personal preference would be. Now that I have the armature of my organic done, all I'm going to do is use the blend ball brush and with my gunpowder use it to pull out shapes to create muscles, using the arrow to smooth on occasion. Remember that we are working in a 360 here, so it's very important to be checking every angle of the organic as you create it. If you stand in one spot for too long, you might get it looking good on one side and have the rest of the sides looking incorrect. So just keep circling and make sure it looks good at every angle. It's also helpful to be able to carve into your organic as opposed to just pulling out shapes and smoothing it over. One thing you could use is the Voxel Eraser brush, which could work. This is an exaggerated example of what it does. I tend to use this mostly when I'm deleting a section and want to redo it. Even with a smaller size though, it does tend to remove more than I want when I'm carving. Not to mention, you do have to type out the blend ball command every time you want to switch back and forth. So what I do instead is I just create a small sphere brush that will place air with a mask to whatever block I'm using to build. That way I can keep my blend ball brush and just switch back and forth between tools without having to retype in commands. Now using all of those tools, we're just going to continue to work on this until we get a proper shape going on here. I'm not going to get it perfectly smooth yet, I'm just focusing on the shape and the muscle structure. I'm also going to use my gunpowder to pull out this really rough head, just to help me get started. That's about as far as I go with brushes, since they can only take you so far. Now I'm going to spend the rest of the time smoothing this by hand and adding in all of the missing details like the hands and the feet. Now here are some of my smoothing tips when smoothing by hand. I'm trying to reduce as many flat edges and straight edges as possible, since we are working with cubes and trying to create curves. One of the most obvious things to look out for is just any little holes or single blocks that stick out in your organic. Little single blocks like this just emphasize their cube shape and they don't really blend with the rest of the organic. Now in rare cases where you need extra tiny detail, it might be necessary, but not for a place like this. An alternative to removing the block is just to connect it with another layer. This goes along the lines of thinking about reducing as many flat edges as possible, since we do want to look curved from every angle. Another thing to watch out for is extremely straight edges, especially on a diagonal like this. I'm going to try to create a more gradual curve with this, so it's not just this huge straight line in the middle. But you also don't want to just cut straight across either, since that creates more straight edges we don't want. So instead I'm going to break it up by adding different lengths to each of these verticals. This will break it up and blend it all together so it's not drawing your eye to that straight line. One more tip is, in order to create a shape that's as smooth as you could possibly get it, I want all of my layers to be evenly spaced from each other, as well as evenly curved. I'm trying to avoid having the layers touching each other on the corners or edges. In many cases, I know that's impossible, but for larger, flatter areas like this, I want to try to avoid it as much as possible. Not everyone has the patience to go through whole organic and do this. I know I spend most of my time just smoothing things by hand, but I do personally think it makes the organic come together and look a little more natural in shape. Now I'm going to veer off from the human for a second and just show you how I build my heads in general. What I usually do is I create an outline that would be at the center point of the head. So I outline the entire profile of the face, and then I build out half of it, and then copy and flip this to the other side. Pretty easy. So going back to my human, I'm just going to reshape it with those same techniques in mind. I'm going to mark out the profile or the outline of the shape in the middle, and then fix up half of it and copy and flip it to the other side. Next, I'm going to do the hands, and it's always best to just look at your own hands when creating them. I would say the most important thing to think about as you build them is to make sure that you can identify each individual finger. Especially on smaller scales like this, where making the hands is a lot more challenging. For the feet, it's kind of the same thing. You could look at your own to help get the shape. The feet I've done here are really small and not very detailed at all. In fact, they don't even look very realistic, but you will inevitably have to go through them by hand to make sure that they are properly shaped. Just to give you a quick comparison, here is how our organic looked before and after smoothing it by hand. I'll let you decide whether you think it's worth it or not. This isn't perfect by any means, I just built it for the sake of this tutorial, but it still gives you an idea of some things to think about as you create an organic. Like I said, I do use these same techniques in every organic I do. There's testament to that in all of my previous time lapses, and if you haven't seen those, you should check those out. But getting the shaping and the proportions and the pose right is the most important thing about creating organics, and also the most challenging. If you can master that, you can create just about anything. So I hope I was able to help you in the very least get an idea of how to start an organic and how to go about creating the basic shapes. That's all I'm going to show you today for this tips video. If you do have questions, feel free to mention those in the comments, or even join my Discord and ask me there. Thank you guys for watching. I hope to see you some other time. Bye!